My name is Madison Hayes, I'm 25, and 3 days ago I discovered my entire life has been built on lies. What started as a normal family birthday dinner ended with me learning about a $3 million trust fund my parents had hidden from me for my entire adult life. But that wasn't even the worst part. The worst part was discovering why they hid it, what they'd been doing with the money, and how far my own family was willing to go to keep me powerless. As I sit here in my grandfather's lawyer's office, holding documents that prove everything, I can't stop thinking about how one birthday cake changed everything forever. Before we dive into this incredible story of family betrayal and ultimate justice, I'd love to know, where are you watching from today? If you're ready to hear how my grandfather became my hero and my parents got exactly what they deserved, hit that like button and subscribe, because this family drama is about to get wild. Growing up in the Hayes household, everything looked picture perfect from the outside. My parents, Robert and Catherine Hayes, were the epitome of upper-middle-class success in our Connecticut suburb. Dad worked as a senior partner at a prestigious law firm, while Mom ran her interior design business from our immaculately decorated home. They drove luxury cars, belonged to the country club, and never seemed to worry about money. Yet, somehow, they always made me feel like we were just scraping by. From the time I was 16 and wanted to get my first job, they discouraged it. "Focus on your studies," Madison, Dad would say. "We can handle your expenses." But their version of handling expenses meant I got a modest allowance, wore clothes from Target while my friends shopped at designer stores, and was constantly reminded that college would be a significant financial burden on the family. When I graduated high school with a 4.0 GPA and got accepted to several Ivy League schools, my parents sat me down for what they called a reality check. Mom dabbed her eyes with a tissue as Dad explained that while they were proud of me, private universities were simply beyond their means. "We've looked at our finances extensively," he said, his voice heavy with what seemed like genuine regret. "State school is the responsible choice for our family." I felt crushing disappointment, but also guilt for wanting more than what my hard-working parents could provide. So I enrolled at the University of Connecticut, took out student loans to cover what their sacrifice couldn't, and worked 20 hours a week at a campus coffee shop to pay for textbooks and basic necessities. My parents praised my work ethic and responsible attitude, which only made me try harder to be worthy of their pride. College was a constant struggle. While my roommate got care packages filled with expensive snacks and her parents sent her money for spring break trips, I survived on ramen noodles and worked through every holiday to make rent. I watched my parents' social media posts showing their weekend getaways to Martha's Vineyard and their renovated kitchen that cost more than my entire college education, but I never questioned it. They'd taught me that wanting more was selfish, that family money was tight, and that my job was to be grateful for what they could provide. After graduation, I moved back home temporarily while job hunting. The temporary stay stretched to 2 years as I worked entry-level positions that barely covered my student loan payments. My parents charged me rent. Not much, just enough to teach responsibility. And I felt grateful they weren't charging market rate. They'd remind me regularly how expensive it was to maintain their lifestyle while supporting an adult child, and I believed them completely. During those 2 years, I watched them upgrade their cars twice, redo their master bathroom, and take a month-long European vacation. When I asked how they could afford such luxuries while struggling with my presence in their home, Mom would sigh and explain that they'd been saving for years for these things, and that my grandfather occasionally helped with small gifts when he could. She made it sound like Grandpa Joe slipped them $100 here and there, not like he was funding their lavish lifestyle. Grandpa Joe was my father's father, a quiet man in his 80s who lived modestly in a small apartment across town. He'd worked his whole life as a machinist, never seeming wealthy, driving an old pickup truck and wearing the same flannel shirts for years. When I'd visit him, we'd sit in his simple kitchen, eating store-bought cookies and talking about books. He never mentioned money, never seemed to have much, and always insisted on paying when we'd go to the local diner for lunch. "A gentleman always pays," he'd say with a wink, pulling crumpled bills from his worn wallet. My parents' relationship with Grandpa Joe seemed strained. They'd visit him dutifully once a month, but the conversations were always stilted and brief. Dad would get tense before these visits, and Mom would make excuses to stay home whenever possible. I assumed it was normal family dynamics. Adult children feeling obligated to visit an aging parent they didn't have much in common with. I never suspected that beneath their polite exchanges lay a secret that would eventually destroy everything I thought I knew about my family. The truth was hiding in plain sight, but I'd been conditioned since childhood to never question my parents' financial decisions or ask uncomfortable questions about money. They'd created the perfect environment to keep me ignorant, grateful, and dependent while they lived off money that was rightfully mine. My 25th birthday fell on a crisp October evening, and my parents insisted on hosting dinner at their house. It seemed like a typical Hayes family celebration. Mom had prepared my favorite meal. Dad had selected an expensive bottle of wine. And they'd even invited Grandpa Joe, which was unusual since they typically kept family gatherings small and controlled. Grandpa Joe arrived early, carrying a small wrapped box that looked modest compared to the elaborate gift presentation my parents were known for. He seemed different that evening. More alert, more purposeful. Instead of his usual quiet demeanor, he kept checking his watch and glancing toward the front door as if expecting someone else to arrive. When I asked if he was feeling all right, he patted my hand and said, "Just excited to celebrate my granddaughter properly for once." Dinner proceeded normally until dessert. Mom had made my favorite chocolate cake, and as she placed it in front of me with 25 flickering candles, Grandpa Joe suddenly stood up. Before Madison makes her wish, he announced, his voice stronger than I'd heard it in years, "I have something important to give her. Something that should have been given a long time ago." My parents exchanged a look that I now realize was pure panic, but at the time, I thought they were just surprised by Grandpa Joe's interruption of their carefully orchestrated celebration. Dad cleared his throat. "Dad, maybe after cake." "No," Grandpa Joe said firmly. "It's been after cake for 7 years too long." He handed me the small box with trembling hands. "Madison, sweetie, this contains information about something that belongs to you. Something you should have known about when you turned 18. Inside the box was a key and a folded piece of paper with an address I didn't recognize. My parents had gone completely silent, their faces pale in the candlelight. "Grandpa Joe, what is this?" I asked, turning the key over in my palm. "It's the key to a safe deposit box," he said, his eyes never leaving my parents' faces. "A safe deposit box that contains documents about your trust fund. The trust fund your great-grandmother established for you when you were born. The trust fund that's been generating income for 25 years. The trust fund that's currently worth just over $3 million. The words hit me like a physical blow. $3 million. Trust fund. I looked at my parents, waiting for them to explain the confusion, to laugh at Grandpa Joe's obvious mistake. Instead, I watched my father's face crumble and my mother begin to cry. Not the delicate tears she shed during touching movie scenes, but ugly, desperate sobs. "Dad, you promised," Mom whispered. "You promised you'd never tell her." "I promised I'd give you time to do the right thing," Grandpa Joe replied, his voice steady despite his obvious emotion. 7 years was more than enough time. She deserved to know when she turned 18. She deserved to know when she was struggling through college. She deserved to know when she was working multiple jobs just to survive. But you kept taking and taking, and I couldn't watch anymore. The room spun around me as pieces began falling into place. The European vacation the year I graduated college. The kitchen renovation that happened while I was working 60-hour weeks to make ends meet. The new cars, the country club membership, the casual way they'd maintain their lifestyle while I struggled with student loans. Taking, I managed to whisper. "What do you mean, taking?" Dad finally found his voice, though it came out as a broken croak. "Madison, we can explain. We were managing the fund for you. We were making sure it would be available when you really needed it. By spending it," the words came out louder than I intended. "By letting me take out loans while you lived off my money, it wasn't supposed to be like this," Mom sobbed. "We just borrowed a little at first. We were going to pay it back. But then your father's business expenses and the house needed work, and we thought we had time to replace it before you needed to know." Grandpa Joe's expression was a mixture of sadness and determination. "They've spent almost $800,000 of your money, Madison. Money that was supposed to pay for your college, help you buy a house, give you the freedom to pursue your dreams without financial worry. Instead, they've been using you as their personal trust fund while making you feel guilty for existing. The betrayal was so complete, so devastating, that I couldn't process it all at once. Every time I'd felt grateful for their sacrifices, they'd been spending my inheritance. Every time I'd worked extra shifts to afford basic necessities, they'd been planning their next luxury purchase with my money. Every time they'd made me feel like a burden, they'd been literally living off my wealth. The drive to the bank the next morning felt surreal. Grandpa Joe sat beside me in my beat-up Honda Civic, the car I'd saved for months to afford while my parents drove vehicles worth more than my annual salary. His weathered hands held copies of documents he'd kept hidden for years, insurance against this very moment. "I need you to understand something, Madison," he said as we pulled into the parking lot. "Your great-grandmother, my mother-in-law, was a remarkable woman. She built a small fortune through careful investments and real estate purchases over her lifetime. When you were born, she was so excited to have a great-granddaughter that she immediately established this trust with very specific instructions." Inside the bank, the safe deposit box revealed a treasure trove of documents that painted a picture of calculated deception spanning 7 years. There were trust documents showing that the fund should have been turned over to me at 18, with a provision that I could access the principal for education expenses immediately. There were quarterly statements showing steady growth from the initial $2 million to over $3 million. And there were withdrawal records that made my stomach turn. My parents hadn't just borrowed money here and there, they had systematically drained the account for years, forging my signature on withdrawal forms and using their position as temporary trustees to access funds that legally belonged to me. The European vacation, $35,000. The kitchen renovation, $58,000. Dad's new BMW, $72,000. The list went on, each expense more infuriating than the last. "But how is this legal?" I asked. The bank manager, a kind woman named Mrs. Patterson, who'd been handling the account since its inception. "How could they just take my money, Mrs. Patterson's expression was grim. "Your parents were listed as trustees until your 21st birthday, at which point the account should have been transferred to your direct control. However, they filed paperwork claiming you were mentally incompetent to manage the funds and needed extended guardianship. They provided falsified medical documents and had a doctor sign off on the evaluation. The medical documents were the most shocking discovery. Dr. Richard Henley, a colleague of my father's from his law firm days, had signed papers declaring that I suffered from severe anxiety and depression that impaired my decision-making capabilities regarding financial matters. I had never met Dr. Henley. I had never been evaluated for any mental health issues. The entire evaluation was fabricated to keep me from accessing my own inheritance. "This is fraud," I said, my voice barely controlled. "This is theft. This is—" I couldn't find words for the magnitude of betrayal I was discovering. Grandpa Joe reached over and squeezed my hand. "This is why I finally had to tell you. I've been fighting them privately for years, threatening to expose everything if they didn't come clean and return your money. But they kept promising they'd tell you soon while continuing to spend. When they took $40,000 last month for a new roof they didn't need, I knew they'd never stop. The roof that I'd helped them research contractors for. The roof I'd spent weekends helping Dad get quotes for because I thought my parents were struggling to afford necessary home maintenance. They'd used my labor to help them spend my money, and I'd been grateful for the opportunity to contribute to the family." Mrs. Patterson pulled out a folder containing correspondence between Grandpa Joe and the bank. For 3 years he'd been trying to get them to investigate the suspicious activity on my account. He documented every fraudulent withdrawal, every forged signature, every illegal extension of the guardianship that should have ended years ago. He'd built an ironclad case while protecting me from the devastating truth for as long as possible. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" I asked him, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. His eyes filled with tears. "Because they're still your parents, sweetheart. Because I hoped they'd find their conscience and do the right thing. Because I didn't want to be the one to destroy your faith in the people who raised you." He paused, struggling with emotion. But watching you struggle while they lived in luxury with your money, I couldn't bear it anymore. You deserved better than what they were giving you, and you deserved to know why you were struggling when you didn't have to. The bank manager presented me with forms to regain control of my account and begin the process of recovering the stolen funds. The legal implications were severe: fraud, forgery, elder abuse, since they'd manipulated Grandpa Joe's position as the original executor. And theft of this magnitude could result in serious criminal charges and civil liability. As we sat in the bank's private office, surrounded by evidence of my parents' betrayal, I felt something shift inside me. The grateful, understanding daughter they'd raised was disappearing, replaced by someone who understood that love and loyalty had to be earned, not demanded. They'd taught me to be grateful for scraps, while they feasted on wealth that belonged to me. They'd taught me that wanting financial security was selfish, while they secured their luxury lifestyle with my inheritance. But they'd made one crucial mistake: they'd underestimated the quiet strength of the grandfather they'd dismissed as a harmless old man. Grandpa Joe had spent years gathering evidence, building relationships with bank officials, and preparing for this moment when their greed finally outweighed their caution. You know what's wild about family betrayal? Sometimes the people you least suspect turn out to be your greatest allies. Grandpa Joe could have stayed silent, could have kept the peace, but he chose justice over comfort. If you're invested in finding out how I made my parents face the consequences of their actions, stick around, because the next part is where I stopped being their victim and started being their reckoning. The week following my discovery felt like living in an alternate reality. I moved out of my parents' house that same night, taking only my personal belongings and leaving behind the carefully constructed lie I'd been living. Grandpa Joe insisted I stay in his spare room, and for the first time in years I felt like I was in a home where someone genuinely cared about my well-being rather than what I could provide. My parents' reaction to my departure was swift and predictable. Dad showed up at Grandpa Joe's apartment the next morning, not with apologies or explanations, but with threats. "You're making a huge mistake, Madison," he said through the door, when I refused to let him in. "Family disputes should stay in the family. Taking this public will destroy all of us, including you." But I was done protecting their reputation at the expense of my own future. I'd already contacted the law firm that handled my great-grandmother's original estate planning, and they'd referred me to a specialist in financial fraud cases. Attorney Sarah Chen was a sharp woman in her 40s, who'd built her career on cases exactly like mine. Adult children discovering that their trustees had embezzled their inheritances. "The good news," Sarah told me during our first meeting, "is that your grandfather documented everything meticulously. Bank records, forged signatures, fraudulent medical evaluations. This is one of the most clear-cut cases I've seen. The bad news is that recovery won't be immediate, and your parents will likely fight this aggressively." She was right about them fighting aggressively. Within days of my filing a formal complaint with the bank, my parents hired their own attorney and began what could only be described as a character assassination campaign. They reached out to extended family members, painting me as an ungrateful daughter who was being manipulated by a senile old man. They claimed I was having a mental breakdown and couldn't be trusted to make rational decisions about my finances. The irony wasn't lost on me that they were using the exact same tactics they'd employed to steal my money in the first place, questioning my mental competency and painting themselves as the responsible adults protecting everyone from my allegedly poor judgment. But this time I had documentation, legal representation, and most importantly, I had Grandpa Joe's unwavering support. My mother tried a different approach, showing up at my work with tears in her eyes and a story about family loyalty. "Madison, honey, we never meant for things to go this far," she said, as I stood in the lobby of the nonprofit where I worked, acutely aware that my coworkers were witnessing this humiliating spectacle. "We were trying to protect you from the burden of managing so much money at such a young age. We thought we were helping." I kept my voice low, but the anger was unmistakable. "You helped yourselves to $800,000 of my money while I lived on ramen noodles and took out student loans. You helped yourselves to European vacations while I worked 2 jobs to afford my car payment. Exactly who were you helping, Mom? She reached for my hands, her perfectly manicured nails, a stark reminder of the luxury lifestyle she'd maintained with my inheritance. We can fix this. We can work out a payment plan. But please don't destroy our family over money. The audacity was breathtaking. She was asking me not to destroy our family over money that she had stolen from me. She was positioning herself as the victim in a situation where she was clearly the perpetrator. But more than that, she was still treating me like the naive child who'd believed their lies for so many years. Our family was destroyed the moment you decided my inheritance was your personal piggy bank, I told her. I'm not destroying anything that wasn't already broken. The investigation moved quickly once the bank turned over all their records to Sarah's legal team. The forensic accounting revealed that the theft was even more extensive than we'd initially discovered. My parents hadn't just taken money for luxury purchases. They'd been supplementing their income with my trust fund for years, using it to maintain a lifestyle that their actual earnings couldn't support. Dad's law firm partnership was partially built on the financial stability my inheritance had provided. Mom's interior design business had been funded with my money from the initial startup costs to the expensive sample materials she kept in their home office. Even their mortgage payments had been supplemented with trust fund withdrawals during lean months. They'd built their entire adult lives on wealth that belonged to me while teaching me to feel guilty for basic necessities. The forged medical evaluation proved to be their biggest mistake. Dr. Henley, when contacted by investigators, claimed he had no memory of ever conducting a psychological evaluation on me. When presented with documents bearing his signature, he became defensive and eventually admitted that he'd signed the papers as a favor to my father without ever meeting me or conducting any actual evaluation. This opens them up to criminal charges, Sarah explained. Document fraud, identity theft, embezzlement. The district attorney's office is very interested in prosecuting this case. Your parents aren't just facing civil liability anymore. They're looking at potential prison time. But the most damaging revelation came when we discovered that this wasn't their first attempt at financial manipulation within the family. Sarah's investigation uncovered that they'd also been systematically borrowing against Grandpa Joe's retirement accounts, using their position as his emergency contacts to access funds during what they claimed were medical emergencies that never existed. Grandpa Joe had been too embarrassed to tell me that his modest lifestyle wasn't entirely by choice. My parents had been draining his accounts too, leaving him with just enough to maintain his small apartment and basic necessities. While they lived lavishly, the man I'd worried didn't have enough money to take me to lunch had actually been supporting my parents' lifestyle with his own retirement savings. They told me it was temporary, he admitted, his voice shaking with anger and humiliation. They said Robert's practice was going through a rough patch, and they just needed to borrow against my accounts until things improved. That was 5 years ago. They never paid back a penny. The scope of their financial manipulation was staggering. They'd stolen from me, stolen from Grandpa Joe, and built their reputation in the community as successful, responsible adults, using money they'd taken from their own family members. Every time someone had complimented their beautiful home, successful business, or generous charitable donations, they'd been praised for achievements funded by theft. As the legal case built momentum, I watched my parents' carefully constructed facade begin to crumble. The stress was affecting their health, their marriage, and their standing in the community. Dad's law firm quietly asked him to take a leave of absence once news of the investigation leaked. Mom's interior design clients began canceling contracts when rumors spread about her business practices. But instead of taking responsibility and trying to make amends, they doubled down on their narrative of being persecuted by an ungrateful daughter. They hired a public relations consultant and began giving interviews to local media positioning themselves as victims of elder abuse, claiming that Grandpa Joe had manipulated me into destroying my relationship with my parents. The civil trial began on a cold February morning 6 months after my 25th birthday revelation. The courthouse steps were crowded with local reporters as my parents' public relations campaign had turned our family dispute into a community spectacle. They'd positioned themselves as pillars of the community being torn down by false accusations, but Sarah Chen had prepared a presentation that would systematically demolish every lie they'd told. The first day of testimony focused on the paper trail. Sarah methodically walked the jury through bank records, showing exactly how my parents had accessed my trust fund and where every dollar had gone. She displayed photographs of their luxury purchases alongside my college transcripts, showing the financial aid and student loans I'd needed to complete my education. The contrast was devastating. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Sarah said during her opening statement, "this case isn't about family disagreements or generational misunderstandings. This case is about two adults who systematically stole nearly $1 million from their own daughter while watching her struggle financially for years. This case is about parents who forged medical documents, lied to banks, and manipulated an elderly man to maintain access to money that never belonged to them." My parents' attorney tried to paint their actions as well-intentioned financial management, arguing that they'd been protecting me from the burden of managing substantial wealth at a young age. But this narrative fell apart when Sarah presented evidence of their own financial irresponsibility: credit card debts, failed investments, and a lifestyle that consistently exceeded their legitimate income. The most damaging testimony came from Dr. Henley, who admitted under oath that he'd never met me but had signed the psychological evaluation as a personal favor to my father. His discomfort was obvious as he explained that he'd trusted my father's description of my alleged mental health issues without conducting any professional assessment. "So, to be clear," Dr. Sarah said, "you declared a young woman mentally incompetent to manage her own finances without ever speaking to her, examining her, or conducting any professional evaluation whatsoever. I trusted Robert's judgment. He said it was a temporary measure to protect her from making poor financial decisions." "And how much was Mr. Hayes paying you for this professional opinion?" "The amount was $25,000. Paid from my trust fund, of course. My parents had literally used my money to pay for the fraudulent evaluation that kept them in control of my money." The circular corruption was so blatant that several jury members visibly reacted with disgust. When my father took the stand in his own defense, his polished attorney demeanor cracked under Sarah's cross-examination. She forced him to read aloud from bank statements, showing his withdrawals for luxury items. While I worked multiple jobs to afford basic necessities, she made him explain why he'd never told me about my inheritance during the years I'd struggled to pay for college. "We were waiting for the right time," he said, his voice barely audible. "We wanted to make sure she was mature enough to handle that level of financial responsibility." Mature enough? Sarah's voice rose with incredulity. She was working 60 hours a week while maintaining a full course load in college. She was paying her own rent, buying her own groceries, and managing her own expenses, without any help from you. How exactly was she not mature enough to be told about her own inheritance? She was young. She might have made poor decisions. Poor decisions like buying luxury cars with money that wasn't hers. Poor decisions like taking expensive vacations during a pandemic while her own child struggled to pay rent. Poor decisions like that, Mr. Hayes. The cross-examination revealed not just the scope of their theft, but the casual cruelty with which they'd maintained it. Dad admitted that they'd discussed my financial struggles during their European vacation, joking about my character-building work ethic, while lounging on beaches paid for with my inheritance. Mom had posted Instagram photos of their luxury hotel room on the same day I'd called them, asking to borrow money for car repairs. When my mother testified, her performance was even more damaging to their case. She broke down crying multiple times, but instead of expressing remorse for stealing from me, she lamented the destruction of their family's reputation and the stress the legal proceedings were causing her marriage. "This has torn our family apart," she sobbed. "Madison used to be such a sweet, grateful girl. Now she's turned into someone we don't recognize, someone who would destroy her own parents over money." Sarah let that statement hang in the air for a moment before responding. "Mrs. Hayes, the money in question isn't money. It's nearly $1 million that belonged to your daughter. Money that could have paid for her education, helped her buy a home, or provided financial security for her future. Are you saying she should have remained grateful while you spent her inheritance on your own luxury lifestyle? We were planning to tell her eventually. When, after you'd spent all of it, the question hung unanswered because, based on their spending patterns, that's exactly what would have happened. If Grandpa Joe hadn't intervened, I would have eventually learned about my trust fund only after it was completely empty, leaving me with nothing but legal bills and the knowledge that my parents had stolen my entire inheritance. Grandpa Joe's testimony was the most powerful moment of the trial. Despite his age and the emotional toll of the proceedings, he spoke with clarity and conviction about watching his granddaughter struggle while her parents lived lavishly on her inheritance. I raised Robert to be better than this, he said, looking directly at my father. I taught him about honor, about responsibility, about protecting family. Watching him steal from his own daughter while she worked herself to exhaustion. It broke my heart. But watching her thank him for the scraps he threw her while he lived like a king on her money, that broke my soul. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. They found my parents liable for fraud, theft, conversion, and breach of fiduciary duty. The financial judgment was comprehensive. Full restitution of the stolen funds, plus interest punitive damages, totaling an additional $2 million and all legal fees. My parents would have to liquidate virtually everything they owned to pay the judgment. But the financial judgment was just the beginning. The district attorney's office had been monitoring the trial, and within hours of the civil verdict, criminal charges were filed. Dad faced charges for fraud, embezzlement, and document forgery. Mom was charged as an accessory and for her role in the conspiracy. Dr. Henley faced charges related to the fraudulent medical evaluation. As I sat in the courthouse listening to the verdicts, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, the weight of constant financial stress finally lifting from my shoulders. For the first time since college, I could breathe without worrying about money. But more importantly, I'd learned that I was stronger than the grateful, naive girl my parents had raised me to be. The aftermath of the trial was swift and merciless. Within 2 months, my parents were forced to sell their beautiful house, their luxury cars, and most of their possessions to begin paying the judgment. Dad's legal career was effectively over. No firm would hire an attorney convicted of fraud and embezzlement. Mom's interior design business collapsed when her criminal charges became public knowledge. But the most satisfying moment came when I received a call from their bankruptcy attorney. Despite liquidating everything they owned, my parents couldn't cover the full judgment. They would be making monthly payments to me for the rest of their lives, ensuring they'd never forget the cost of their betrayal. Every month for decades to come, they'd be reminded that their greed had destroyed not just our relationship but their entire comfortable lifestyle. The criminal sentencing was equally satisfying. Dad received 18 months in minimum security prison plus 5 years of probation. Mom got 6 months of home detention and 3 years of probation. Dr. Henley lost his medical license and received substantial fines. All 3 would have felony convictions on their records permanently. Meanwhile, my life transformed completely. With my trust fund restored and growing again through proper investments, I could finally pursue dreams I'd never allowed myself to imagine. I left my entry-level nonprofit job and enrolled in graduate school to study social work, focusing on financial abuse and family manipulation. I wanted to help other people recognize and escape the kind of systematic exploitation I'd endured. Grandpa Joe and I grew closer than ever during this period. I moved him out of his modest apartment into a beautiful senior living community where he could enjoy the retirement he deserved. We had lunch every Sunday, and he delighted in hearing about my studies and my plans for the future. The man who'd saved me from a lifetime of financial manipulation became my closest confidant and greatest supporter. "You know what I'm most proud of," he told me one Sunday afternoon as we sat in his new apartment's garden. "Not that you got your money back, not that your parents faced consequences. I'm proud that you learned you're worth more than scraps. You learned that love isn't supposed to come with financial punishment attached." He was right. The most valuable thing I'd gained wasn't the $3 million. It was self-respect. I'd learned to recognize manipulation, to demand honesty in relationships, and to trust my own judgment about what I deserved from the people who claimed to love me. 6 months after the trial, I received a letter from my mother. She was writing from their rental apartment, a modest two-bedroom place that represented a dramatic downgrade from their former luxury. The letter was full of self-pity and requests for reconciliation, but notably absent of any genuine apology or acknowledgement of the harm they'd caused. She wrote about how much they missed me, how the family wasn't complete without me, how they hoped I'd find it in my heart to forgive them, so we could move past this difficult time. She mentioned their financial struggles as if I should feel guilty for enforcing the legal judgment. She talked about Dad's difficulty finding work as if his unemployability was my fault rather than the natural consequence of his criminal convictions. What struck me most about the letter was how it perfectly encapsulated everything that had been wrong with our relationship from the beginning. Even facing the consequences of their theft, they still couldn't acknowledge that they'd done anything truly wrong. They still viewed themselves as the victims of my overreaction rather than the perpetrators of systematic financial abuse. I never responded to the letter. Instead, I focused on building relationships with people who valued honesty, who celebrated my successes instead of sabotaging them, and who understood that love meant supporting each other's growth rather than exploiting vulnerabilities. My new life included genuine friends who knew my full story and supported my healing process. I was dating someone who admired my strength rather than trying to exploit my gratitude. I was pursuing meaningful work that would help other people escape financial manipulation. Most importantly, I was learning to trust my own judgment and value my own worth. The $3 million gave me financial security, but the real treasure was discovering that I deserved better than the crumbs my parents had trained me to accept. I deserved honesty, respect, and genuine love, not the conditional approval they'd offered in exchange for my silence about their theft. Sometimes people ask if I regret destroying my relationship with my parents or if I miss having them in my life. The answer is complicated but ultimately clear. I don't miss the relationship we had because it was built on lies and exploitation. I miss the relationship I thought we had, the one where they were loving parents making sacrifices for my well-being rather than thieves stealing my inheritance while watching me struggle. But I've learned that you can't miss what never truly existed. Their love was always conditional on my ignorance and gratitude. Their support was always temporary and calculated. Their sacrifices were always illusions funded by money that belonged to me. Once I understood the truth, there was no relationship left to preserve. Today, as I write this story, I'm 26 years old and finishing my master's degree in social work. I own my apartment, I have no debt, and I'm building a career focused on helping families heal from financial abuse and manipulation. Grandpa Joe is thriving in his new community, surrounded by friends and activities he genuinely enjoys. My parents are still making monthly payments on their judgment, still dealing with the legal and social consequences of their choices, still living with the knowledge that their greed cost them their daughter, their lifestyle, and their reputations. Justice wasn't just served. It was served cold, calculated, and completely. Here's what I want to know from all of you watching this. Have you ever discovered that someone you trusted was taking advantage of you financially? Have you ever had to choose between family loyalty and standing up for yourself? Drop a comment below and share your story. I read every single one, and your experiences help other people realize they're not alone in these situations. If this story resonated with you, if it helped you recognize manipulation in your own life, or if you just enjoyed watching justice get served, please hit that like button and subscribe for more real-life drama stories. Share this video with anyone who needs to hear that they deserve better than financial manipulation disguised as family love. Thank you for being part of this community, where we support each other through life's most challenging family dynamics. Remember, you are worth more than scraps, your financial security matters, and real love never comes with theft attached. Until next time, keep standing up for yourselves, and never let anyone convince you that wanting what's rightfully yours makes you ungrateful.